According to international human rights law, photographing prisoners in a way that might compromise their dignity is generally forbidden. Yet the American Central Intelligence Agency did exactly this before sending detainees to be tortured in other countries. Is the naked photography a form of sexual assault? Yes, it's a form of sexual humiliation, said Dr. Vincent Iacopino, the medical director of Physicians for Human Rights, adding it's cruel, inhumane and degrading treatment at a minimum and may constitute torture. The report, published by the Guardian newspaper, claimed the CIA took such photographs as insurance against legal and political fallout from the brutal treatment of detainees by partner intelligence agencies. A medical and human rights expert called the practices sexual humiliation, while others described them as a potential war crime. In some photos, detainees are blindfolded and bound with visible bruises. In others, CIA officials or contractors appear to be standing alongside the naked captives. Why do so many US institutions have such a poor human rights record? Can families of terror victims prosecute the CIA? And how credible are America's comments about freedom and torture? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. Now, a new report shows that the CIA has taken naked photographs of its detainees, many exhibiting severe bruising. Is this sexual abuse, or could it also amount to a war crime? We asked the American public.
Well, I wouldn't really know. It's not really my area of expertise, but certainly I wouldn't want any of my family members having photos taken in that manner.
That could be a war crime. I mean, again, it's hard to know without more information, but it could be both.
I think both, because that's just disrespectful. It doesn't matter who they are, it's disrespectful.
If it's abuse of that sort of nature, that sounds something, obviously can't be tolerated.
Does that amount to a war crime? I'm not to judge. I don't really know what the category of a war crime is, but I do feel it is abuse if you're taking a picture, yes.
Both. I think it could be both. Yeah, absolutely.
I think it is a war crime, yeah.
I believe this could be a war crime.
I think it's both, because infringing on a body in such a way is always considered sexual in today's context, and it's very brutal. It is a crime as well.
Do our experts regard these naked pictures and signs of severe bruising as sexual abuse or a war crime?
The photos that we've been hearing about of the CIA prisoners being photographed naked and exhibiting bruising, so they've obviously been physically assaulted. It's not surprising, but it's terrible to hear of it. And of course, this is a sign of them being mistreated when they should have been treated humanely. It could be more serious than that, I think, the implications of it. I think it would be part of a whole problem that came about with the way the Americans were treating prisoners after 9/11, that it could rise to the level of war crimes.
Well, according to US administrators who've spoken to the media, they suggest this is a way of cataloguing detainees' injuries before they go off to presumably sustain yet more injuries in the countries to which they were rendered. But certainly photography and unnecessary photography of suspects, of detainees, is generally prohibited, for example, by the Geneva Conventions, unless it's necessary for that administration. And certainly if it's part of any sexual humiliation process, that also could amount to torture as well as war crimes. And if we look at the record of the CIA and the interview enhanced so-called interrogation program generally, then sexual humiliation was a current theme throughout that.
The report also confirms that once the CIA took naked photographs of its detainees, it sent them to be tortured in other countries. Which people still believe that the US is a free country and opposes torture? It was a challenging question for the public.
When we talk about free, I have to say freedom. You're talking about freedom. They have so much freedom they become dumb.
I would say most of the citizens of the United States believe that our country is a free country and opposes torture.
People who have privilege, people who are able to ignore this kind of stuff that's happening.
Well, I don't know who believes that that's something that Americans should do. I think most Americans firmly believe that that's not something that we should be doing anywhere in the world. There is a small faction, I think, within America that still does believe that that's acceptable, but I think that's a minority of Americans.
People who don't know, people who are uninformed.
I mean, I believe the U.S. is a free country. You know, the CIA, the FBI, they got to do what they got to do, and I just hope that they don't have to cause too much harm in their search and in their fight to find whoever the bad guys are they're trying to find.
In the light of these recent revelations, to what extent do our experts feel America is truly a free country which opposes torture?
Well, it's very disturbing, isn't it, to hear about prisoners being stripped naked, photographed, and then sent to other places where they're going to be tortured. So this reveals part of this terrible network of black sites that were not only run by the United States, but where they were outsourcing torture to other places. You know, in terms of, do people regard the United States as upholding the values that it claims to believe in? I think what has happened since 9/11 demonstrates very clearly that that's not the case, that America has failed to uphold the standards that it claims to believe in. And until there is, I believe, some proper accountability for what took place, then this is going to remain the case.
It's extraordinary that only in the last few days a poll came out, just really literally days after potential candidate Donald Trump came out and said that he would reintroduce waterboarding, obviously one of the nastiest forms of torture the CIA and others have used, that actually this poll showed in the last few days that some 62% of Americans would support the use of torture if it would save lives and so on. The problem is, of course, that people have been bombarded with pro-torture messages in the US. They've been bombarded with messages from their media to the extent that, or to the effect that what their forces do, what their security services do, is beyond reproach and is designed and achieves only to protect them. And when you look at films, for example, in the past that Hollywood's produced, such as Zero Dark 30, where it fictitiously said or claimed that torture had, for example, led to the capture of bin Laden, it's not surprising in some ways that, given they're only getting this one message, that the US public actually more supports torture than it doesn't support torture.
A former US official says the photos are very gruesome. Why, in the public's view, do so many US institutions, such as the Army, the FBI, the police, and the CIA, have such bad human rights records?
Oh, that's a balancing act. When we're under attack, we have to take some precautions, although it's a delicate balance. You know, we have constitutional rights here in America, but overseas we have a little more leeway in extracting information. Torture, of course, is out. Waterboarding, I think, is not torture. But torture in general is not the way to get information.
I think when you look at war, nobody's got a good human rights record.
I fundamentally disagree with you. I think the United States has the best human rights record in the world, and I fully and wholly support our government in their efforts to make sure that we're all safe in this country.
I don't think it's just the US. I think there are countries all around the world where there's atrocities happening to people, and where there's power and where there's money. I think there's always going to be an abuse of human rights to get to the top. So as long as we keep sort of striving together and making a case for human rights, you know, we'll always have to struggle.
I don't know. I think they hide it well. I think they're very good at hiding it, and it hasn't gone public. People are not aware of it.
I wouldn't be able to say myself, you know what I mean? I don't know. I can't explain it.
I think wartime is really chaotic and crazy, and you can never, like, of course, everybody's not going to play by the rules. That's war. I think taking another human life in itself is just terrible, but that is how our nations have found a way to create peace through war, which doesn't make sense, but I feel like it's a necessary evil. And of course, if something needs to get done, people are going to do terrible things.
What's the expert analysis of the reasons behind the Army, FBI, police, and CIA's bad human rights records?
We understand from an official that these are pretty horrible photographs, and that, I think that's not really surprising. But to be asked, what's the record? Why is there such a poor record of the treatment of people by the military, by other law enforcement agencies in the United States? I'm not sure that we could say that that's permanently a thing. I mean, I think it's important to remember that something happened after 9/11, and the way that the United States reacted was to throw out all its international and domestic laws and treaties regarding the treatment of people, and to come up with this ludicrous notion of the entire world as a battlefield where the normal rules didn't apply. And I think that's why we're confronted, by terrible things like these photographs, which we're hearing. It's 12 years since we saw the Abu Ghraib photos, and we're hearing about the same kind of thing. We're seeing Muslims treated in ways that are obviously going to be particularly offensive to them. Strip them naked, humiliate them. And we're seeing evidence of physical torture. We know there's also been mental torture. So for me, it's all very much tied in with what's been happening since 9/11. I really think that it's important that people realize that it's not just enough that we're told these things don't happen anymore, that we need to be given absolute cast iron guarantees that they aren't going to happen. And that would involve holding people responsible for what took place.
Of course, the institutions concerned would like to say, no doubt, that there were a few what they call bad apples. In other words, the good reputation of the majority is ruined by a few who break the rules. But the problem is that when we look at the evidence, the document trail as to how this torture program, these different torture programs by these organizations originated, you can see that these go to a very high level, both in the command structures of, for example, the military, but particularly the CIA and particularly the US government. But of course, the US government is far from being alone in this. And of course, many institutions around the world still do carry out poor treatment of detainees all over the world in different kinds of institutions. And what's worrying here is that it seems to have been sanctioned at such a high level within the US government.
The CIA has been widely condemned for brutal techniques, such as mock executions and anal penetration. Should we laugh that the US lectures other countries about human rights, or should we be disturbed? What's the public's opinion?
When you talk about human rights and you talk about the CIA, I don't know what information the CIA want to get out of someone, but we can call it torture, whatever you want to call it. But when it comes to children, I'm going to do what I have to do to get the facts about any criminal or any, let me put it this way, any Satanist.
I think any kind of torture is disturbing, so I don't think that that should be something that's condoned. I think as someone who's a private citizen, there's things that aren't agreeable, and so speaking from my own point of view, I wouldn't agree with that.
Disturbed, definitely. I feel like there's a lot wrong with us, how we're hypocrites when we talk about other countries, when we should be focusing on how it's corrupt in our own.
It's a tough question. I definitely don't feel like they should lecture on human rights. I feel like human rights is, it's not for one country to teach another. It's, it has to be someone else's responsibility to educate people on, but by no means is this a measure of human rights, this country. So
we should be disturbed. Did you say anal penetration? Yes, that's disturbing.
Do our experts find it laughable to hear the Washington lecture on other countries?
We've heard terrible stories over the last few years in particular, I think, about the way prisoners have been treated. So when we had the Senate Intelligence Committee's report, or the executive summary of the report about the way the CIA treated prisoners, one particularly horrible thing in there was that people were, there was rectal feeding. I mean, just the very thought of it is just disgusting. But this is all tied in with the fact that after 9/11 there was a very deliberate effort made by parts of the United States administration to go to the dark side, as Dick Cheney said, to start behaving in ways that were not acceptable. And I think what we've had within the United States is different approaches taken by different parts of the administration. So when you look at the State Department, which was not responsible for implementing these things, this was the military and the intelligence services. The State Department issues, reports every year chastising other countries for their human rights record, which obviously is deeply hypocritical given what the United States government has been doing. But they aren't the people who have been actually, responsible for implementing these policies in the first place. That said, I think it would obviously, it would make sense for the State Department to be directing some of these things towards its own government and saying, we must state first and foremost that there are unaddressed issues within our own country that haven't been dealt with.
While human rights, the whole concept of human rights is often abused, used as a means of attacking other countries, your enemies in peacetime. So for example, whereas a very large number of people and organisations have genuine and, if you like, non-partisan concerns over torture and other human rights abuses, it's often the case that, for example, governments and the NGOs, the non-governmental organisations, the think tanks that those governments sponsor, are very selective in their condemnation. It's used as a tool. So that, for example, if we look at the United States and the West generally, they will be very strong in their condemnation of countries such as Iran, such as, for example, Russia, but not in any way near as strong in their condemnation, if any condemnation at all, of countries such as Bahrain, such as Saudi Arabia, Turkey. Of course, these are allies, nominally at least, of the West. And so therefore, one always needs to look at what the purpose of the condemnation is that comes from the United States. And of course, when they've got such a poor background in human rights themselves, it tends to suggest that actually their concern over human rights, when it's expressed, is more concerned with embarrassing perceived opponents than actually having genuine concerns about human rights itself.
The CIA is responsible for much of the spread of ISIL in Syria because it trained militants in 2012. How do the public feel families of terror victims should prosecute the CIA?
Persecute the administration, Obama and Hillary Clinton. They're the ones who started this thing in Libya, in Iraq, in Egypt, in Tunisia. It's Hillary Clinton. It is Barack Obama. It is Susan Rice. It is the whole cadre that has done this for their own ego. Let's overthrow Mr. Mubarak. Let's not forget what happens. Let's just do it. They did this without thinking it through, without having an after-the-fact plan. And that's pretty much the basis for ISIS, I believe.
See, I don't know if you can do that, because then you'd be prosecuting a government. I think it depends on... I mean, people have sued the government before, so it would have to go through a legal process through the judiciary system if that's been found here.
I think the United States is a good example in the world for the way that citizens should be treated as a whole. Of course, there's going to be bad cases here and there, but compared to what I see happening in the rest of the world, I think the United States can stand tall.
I don't think they should. I don't think anyone should persecute anybody.
I don't know if it's even possible to persecute the CIA. I mean, they're really above it all, right? I've heard the horror stories and stuff like that, but you just never know. If you're in there, I guess you know what they're doing, but it's hard to see what they're doing from the outside. I just hope they're doing the right thing.
Tell their stories, get it out there, because people are easily able to ignore it and just think of one side instead of the other.
Given the CIA's role in contributing to the spread of ISIL, what is the expert judgment on whether and how families of terror victims should prosecute the CIA?
One of the terrible things as a result of the way the United States behaved after 9/11 was particularly to destabilize Iraq, and what we've seen as a result of that is the rise of ISIL that is, in a large part the responsibility of the United States and other allies for having illegally invaded the country and toppled Saddam Hussein in the first place. When we're looking at how people might be able to hold the United States to account for that, the problem is, with that, as with everything else, the United States there is no mechanism whereby the United States can be held accountable. In all of the things that have happened since 9/11, in the renditions, in the torture prisons, in the indefinite detention without charge or trial at Guantanamo, the United States refuses to be obliged by other countries even to provide evidence for court cases that people are trying to pursue. Ultimately, it needs to be, I think, that we, the court of public opinion, keep pressure on the United States. The United States is required to police itself on this in the end. That the United States will have to hold its own people responsible for what took place. I think that that's desperately important, because otherwise I think what we see is that these crimes that were committed go unaddressed, and they essentially spread a kind of poison through the body of the countries that are responsible. In this case, we're looking at the United States. And it hasn't been a good thing for America not to have addressed these things. So I would just very much hope that one day people will be held accountable at a high level for the crimes that they've committed.
Well, it's certainly true that many people, including completely innocent people, have of course suffered at the hands of torture programs, of rendition, of detention, including unlawful detention for long periods of time. And also, of course, many people have suffered and are continuing to suffer, ordinary civilians in countries such as Syria, in countries such as Libya, but now also in the forms of blowback in the West. We've seen Brussels, Paris, and so on, in the wake of foreign policy of countries such as the United Kingdom, France to some degree, and the US in spreading jihad as, if you like, a foreign policy tool to destabilise such as places as Syria and Libya. The problem is that for victims it's going to be quite difficult to get justice in this way. They can campaign, they can help to expose what's happened to them, but nonetheless, in many cases the courts will not support their positions. First of all, in many cases, notwithstanding that abuses have occurred. So, for example, here in the United Kingdom, governments will pay out money in order to stop the case going to court. So the victim will get some kind of justice, but won't get their day in court. They won't be able to tell people what happened to them, because of course the government will stop it getting to court. And even if it does go to court, increasingly there is the use of secret courts in our Western democracies, where the evidence is going to be heard in secret. And so really the extent to which there's going to be transparency or accountability is still relatively limited. But nonetheless, one day it may come about that those who carried out these programs, is a spreading of terror in countries in the Middle East as well as in the Western Europe and elsewhere, and also perpetrated and were responsible for these torture programs, may one day in decades to come may actually be held accountable.
Evidence shows the CIA and many other US agencies intentionally photographed naked detainees. They also used brutal techniques like waterboarding, physical abuse, sleep deprivation, mock executions and anal penetration justified as rehydration to interrogate terror suspects following the September 11 attacks. These amount to human rights abuses, war crimes and severe violations of domestic and international laws, accusations which may yet be tested in court.